Outstanding.
And we are live.
Well, Robert, thanks so much for coming on and joining me. My kid's about to go to bed. Sorry for the interruption.
Oh, that's great.
Thanks so much
what
for,
it's all
for
about.
coming on.
Why are we doing what we're doing?
The internet died in there.
Sorry. Come on.
Thanks so much for coming on and joining me, Robert.
Yeah.
We wanted to reach out and talk to you, obviously, in response to the recent tragedies, not just of George Floyd, but of Ahmaud Arbery, of Breonna Taylor, of dozens of other unjust murders that have been occurring in our country. And when it came time to say something, I realized that I probably was not the best, most effective voice to say it. And I wanted to make sure that we were looping in the voices that had firsthand experience. And I don't know of anybody who has more firsthand experience with fighting this fight than you do, Robert. So if you want to take some time, I'm sure more people are watching that know you and don't know me than the other way around. But by all means, if you'd like to let people know who you are and where you're coming from and what we're talking about today.
Well, I think we were going to kind of start the conversation off with some shared life experiences. And shoot, I was kind of excited to hear yours. I want to hear you go first.
Okay. Well, I mean, as far as racial injustice goes, obviously, I don't have that shared life experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I make a point of not trying to do the things that I've seen some politicians do as far as minimizing the grander scheme of things and trying to relate to them personally. So I don't typically tell about, hey, I've got Black friends who have been personally impacted.
Wrong thing to do.
What's that?
The wrong thing to do.
And
I got a Black friend. That man, when we hear that, that's automatic. We already know.
Right. Well, and I mean, that's a very low bar to set, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't give us personal experience with the problem that we're here addressing. The other thing that I see white politicians do that I think we need to steer away from is the color blindness pitch of I don't see color and I treat everybody equally, and seeing color is an important part of the conversation.
Absolutely.
And understanding where generations of oppression are stacked up on some people's shoulders that are not on others. So when I experience these tragedies, I feel them empathically. I feel them, you know, it appalls me. I'm saddened, I'm hurt, but I'm not personally attacked. And I am reflective of times in my life where I have been given the advantage of my race. And it's never, you know, anything overt. It's never anything in the moment that I really thought about, like, I am, you know, being treated this way because I'm white and I wouldn't because I am Black. But I mean, I went to a prestigious private university, which might have been more difficult to get into if I was not white and had my parents who had also gone to the same prestigious university, and it was more difficult for them to get in if they were not white. I have had run-ins with the cops where I got a boys will be boys treatment and let off. Outstanding.
And we are live.
Well, Robert, thanks so much for coming on and joining me. My kid's about to go to bed. Sorry for the interruption.
Oh, that's great.
Thanks so much
what
for,
it's all
for
about.
coming on.
Why are we doing what we're doing?
The internet died in there.
Sorry. Come on.
Thanks so much for coming on and joining me, Robert.
Yeah.
We wanted to reach out and talk to you, obviously, in response to the recent tragedies, not just of George Floyd, but of Ahmaud Arbery, of Breonna Taylor, of dozens of other unjust murders that have been occurring in our country. And when it came time to say something, I realized that I probably was not the best, most effective voice to say it. And I wanted to make sure that we were looping in the voices that had firsthand experience. And I don't know of anybody who has more firsthand experience with fighting this fight than you do, Robert. So if you want to take some time, I'm sure more people are watching that know you and don't know me than the other way around. But by all means, if you'd like to let people know who you are and where you're coming from and what we're talking about today.
Well, I think we were going to kind of start the conversation off with some shared life experiences. And shoot, I was kind of excited to hear yours. I want to hear you go first.
Okay. Well, I mean, as far as racial injustice goes, obviously, I don't have that shared life experience. And I make a point of not trying to do the things that I've seen some politicians do as far as minimizing the grander scheme of things and trying to relate to them personally. So I don't typically tell about, hey, I've got Black friends who have been personally impacted.
Wrong thing to do.
What's that?
The wrong thing to do.
And
I got a Black friend. That man, when we hear that, that's automatic. We already know.
Right. Well, and I mean, that should be, that's a very low bar to set, right? Yeah. And it doesn't give us personal experience with the problem that we're here addressing. The other thing that I see white politicians do that I think we need to steer away from is the color blindness pitch of I don't see color and I treat everybody equally, and seeing color is an important part of the conversation.
Absolutely.
And understanding where generations of oppression are stacked up on some people's shoulders that are not on others. So when I experience these tragedies, I feel them empathically. I feel them, you know, it appalls me. I'm saddened, I'm hurt, but I'm not personally attacked. And I am reflective of times in my life where I have been given the advantage of my race. And it's never, you know, anything overt. It's never anything in the moment that I really thought about, like, I am, you know, being treated this way because I'm white and I wouldn't because I am Black. But I mean, I went to a prestigious private university, which might have been more difficult to get into if I was not white and had my parents who had also gone to the same prestigious university, and it was more difficult for them to get in if they were not white. I have had run-ins with the cops where I got a boys will be boys treatment and let off and gone along my way. Whereas had I been Black, that could have gone very differently and sent my life on a much different trajectory. I've got a young son, and never in the thought of how we're raising him are the thoughts that the police might be anything but a resource for him, a sense of security and peace, and that there's somebody that they should run to if they're in trouble. But obviously, those are not the experiences that my friends of color and my neighbors of color have. One of the reasons why we did decide to move to Shadow Creek was because of the racial makeup, because we are, and in this neighborhood, in this district, in this area of Texas, we're majority minority. And I have friends on my street who celebrate every religion that's out there, who come from every country that's out there, who have all of these different lived experiences. And being able to raise my son adjacent to those, adjacent to other families who have these different experiences, was a priority for us to make sure that he has, and again, he's always going to be shielded by his whiteness, but at least that he can have those secondhand experiences with families that have a different perspective than him, was something that was very important to us.
You know, I heard you say something very important in your conversation, and that is acknowledgement. You know, my daddy used to always tell me, man, that, you know, you can't fix a problem until you first acknowledge that you have one. I think the tragedy of George Floyd is starting to make America acknowledge the death of racial injustice in this country. Maybe some of them are just seeing the racial injustice of that situation. But when we saw the officer with his knee on the neck of George Floyd, we saw the knee of white America on our neck for the past 400 years, which is why you're seeing protests all across the country and all across the world. It was a vivid reminder. You mentioned Ahmaud Arbery and a few others. Shit, man, you can go all the way back to Emmett Till. You can go to the church bombings in Atlanta. You can go back to Rodney King. And in all of those instances, there was no justice. There was no justice. And so that's what we're feeling right now. Even when they announced yesterday that all 3 officers were arrested, I was struck with fear, actually. It wasn't, I was ecstatic, I was happy, I was struck with this fear because I'm like, here we go all over again, right? You know, we have to, you know, play this game all the way to the 4th quarter. When you look up at the scoreboard, you know who will have won and who will have lost.
And I venture to say that even if these 4 police officers are rightfully, accountably held to justice and get a lengthy prison service for the crimes that they've committed, the fight doesn't end there. And that doesn't, because we have a conviction, doesn't mean there is a presence of justice universally. And it goes far beyond the details of an individual case. And because we hear this every time there's one of these tragedies, we see the justifications. We see people come back and say, well, he was in the wrong part of town at the wrong time, and he had something in his pocket, and how would the cops know that wasn't a gun? Or, you know, he had a history of gambling or alcoholism or whatever. And they always try and go back and discredit and get into the specifics of this case. And why would this case be something where we should give the police the benefit of the doubt? But again, when you look at this in the context of, you know, 200 years of slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow, and 100 years of post-Jim Crow, whatever you want to label the current level of oppression we're at right now, in that context, the details are irrelevant. The details don't really impact how the individual case should be handled, because the individual case is one of a series of events that have happened that constantly end up with benefit of doubt being given to the white police officer and suspect being cast on the black victim.
Well, that was another years when I heard this. I mean, you know, first of all, we have to go all the way through the trial process. Hopefully there will be some convictions, but even if there are some convictions, will these convictions be seen as just a token, or will we have made steps in between there to really address this issue of systemic racism in our country? You know, it's funny, you know, as I lobbied last session on criminal justice reform, and as I would go around the state and present our Texas Fair Justice Act, depending on what room I was in, I had to be careful to use or not to use that word, systemic racism, even though it is the underlying issue for the need for comprehensive criminal justice reform. There were some rooms that I just could not bring that up in because automatically they wouldn't hear anything else.
Mm-hmm.
He's bringing up the race card. And so I had to present it in financial terms or moral terms. But one thing that has happened now is that we are hearing people actually acknowledge systemic racism
Mm-hmm.
in this country, actually saying the words, right? And first of all, as a black man that's 62 years old, hell, I don't know how you couldn't say it before. I mean, I've lived through it. I have literally walked through colored and white lines in Giddings, Texas, where my mother is from, right there in the Giddings City Meat Market. We would go back up there and visit my grandmother on the weekends, and we'd always stop there to get some sausages and red soda. Man, it's some of the best in Texas, by the way. We would have to walk through the colored and white line, and where we walked, it was the red dirt of the area up there. And where the white people walked, they was walking on this pretty little white tile, and there was a banister separating us, right? And even at 6, 7 years old, you know, my mother would be in the line and she'd be talking to people across the banister because small town, everybody knew everybody, right? But as a young boy, I'm like, how come we got to walk on the dirt? How come we can't walk on the pretty white tile? And so, I mean, this systemic racism is real. It's been around for centuries. And for us to just now be able to mention that word without being labeled as using the race card, well, it's pathetic. And on the flip side, I guess it's also progress, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, it seems like, you know, centuries get us that much progress. It really needs to find a way to step on the gas pedal.
Come on.
Yeah, but it really does feel like we have a caste system in this country where, and it's still that way, where, and again, my lived experience is I can go jogging in any neighborhood at any time of day, and I've never had to worry about vigilantes thinking that I might have been coming from robbing somebody and pulling a shotgun on. It never even crossed my mind, right? And that goes to everything. I go to a bank to apply for a home loan, and I can very confidently say I will get a home loan and I will probably get a good rate for it. And that's not the case in a lot of different families, and that's almost strictly divided on the color of our skin.
Absolutely. There's not a black person that's watching right now or that you will ever run into that won't be able to give you dozens of stories. I mean, dozens. I mean, we live in it every single day. When I was in the Capitol last session, and I was testifying at the hearing for the Sandra Bland Act, and right before me was one of the leaders of CLEAT, which is the big union, police union thing. And he was arguing against this cite and release piece of legislation that we had because he said, you know, and basically what it is that you can't get arrested for non-jailable offenses. As in Sandra Bland, your turn signal, and then all of a sudden you end up going to jail. And he said that they needed to keep this tool in their toolbox because sometimes when we walk up to the window, the hairs on the back of our neck just raise up. And we use that instinct. Mm-hmm. I came right behind him and I said, the damn hairs on the back of my neck just stood up when I heard that. And I shouldn't even have to testify to any more of you members up there. You should have heard all that you need to see the implicit racism in what he just said.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we saw this with the protesters just earlier on this week, which, by the way, 60,000 protesters hitting the streets in Houston is a huge and monumental thing. Only 200 arrests, which is also, I mean, we can argue over the validity of even those 200 arrests, but by any measure, massive peaceful protests. When you go in and you look at those 200 arrests, about half of them, their cause for arrest is resisting arrest.
Yeah.
And it's like, how can you arrest somebody for resisting arrest if you don't have a precursing crime that you're trying to arrest that person for?
We'll talk about that later, man. That's the need for legislation and protective policy. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's
okay.
It's
well, and then so let's transition into the second half of this conversation that we talked about, which is how do we, and by we I mean white people, advocate for this change, participate in these protests, and empower the movements without taking agency and voice away from the people who have direct experience from it. And that's kind of been this tightrope that I know a lot of other people have been concerned about. Is, we want to help, but we also know that this is not about us. And so how do we best empower those that it is about?
Man, there's no one short answer to that. I will tell you, one way is how we came on this show. Before we came on, before you or Dylan started going over the run of the show, each of you said, "Robert, how are you doing?" Right? Recognizing that this has been a very painful experience for us. I'm still hurting right now. Yesterday, I turned my phone off and I laid in bed all day and watched Gunsmoke. Just had to disconnect, man. I was at the edge of, I felt almost a mental breakdown. It was just too much. We aren't doing okay right now. We aren't doing okay. The protests are a form of release. It is good to see the arrest. But the truth of the matter is, absolutely nothing has changed. Nothing. In 2 months, this will be in the rearview mirror of everybody, and they'll be forgot all about it. We'll be talking about COVID-19 again and talking about the election. Nobody will be speaking about this racial injustice in our country. And that's kind of sad.
Yeah. I absolutely agree. And it is, particularly with the way the news cycles work, you go on to the next shiny object and you forget about the last thing that we've sat here fighting for.
Yeah, but you did ask me how you guys can help. Let me see, can I break this down a little bit? Because it's so many, I look at it, what can white people do as a general populace? I look at it, what white people can do who consider themselves allies, say, in the Democratic Party. What about white people in the Republican Party? As far as the general populace, in order for us to win any movement, in order for there to even be a moral movement in this country, we need numbers. We're only 12% of this population. We cannot do it by ourselves. If you remember, during the civil rights movement of the 60s, we were going nowhere until white people in the North saw us having dogs sit on us, water hoses, the whole thing. And white people from the North came in numbers, and the pendulum started to move in our direction. I was thinking about that last night. I said, man, what would have happened if they wouldn't have come? we might still be in a Jim Crow era if we didn't have the numbers, because numbers is what moves everything, because all of this is going to end up in politics as far as changing policy and legislation and all that stuff. And numbers is what moves the needle, right? I'll give you an example. If the base of Trumpism and or the Republican Party stood together right now and said, listen, you're still our president. We're still going to vote for you. We're still going to support you. But from this day forward, you will stop with the racial division. Yeah, listen to me. If they said that in numbers, he would turn into that chameleon, and trust me, he'd be the biggest black lover out there. Numbers matter, right?
And you're absolutely
right. So how do we need white people in this fight? We need your numbers.
Well, and I do understand nationwide, African Americans are 12%. Here in Brazoria County, it's closer to 25. And when you start to factor in Southeast Asians and other people who, experience racism differently, but are still not protected by the shield of whiteness, we're majority minority in this district this cycle. So this is very much part of the conversation where the microphone is firmly planted in front of the minority communities. And we can and should be advocating for these changes. You make a very good point as far as the numbers justifying where these people stay, and it comes back to the difference between personal and systemic racism. And for my entire life, it's been uncouth. It's been unpopular to say I am personally racist, right? To say I do not like people of another race. Now, whether or not those people actually are, whether they behave differently, they haven't been able to say it out loud in public for my entire life. The systemic racism, the structures that prop up racism that make it harder for Black people to exist in America and easier for white people to exist in America are as strong as they've ever been.
Absolutely.
And when we look at the private prison system, when we look at the militarized police system, when we look at our public education systems, at our mental health systems, they're all skewed in one particular way. And so the question then becomes, and we hear this question batted back and forth all the time, is Trump racist, right? Or is this or that politician racist? And it's almost a moot point, because what is personally in your heart it almost doesn't matter at this point, right? It comes down to, will you fight for the things that will make the system better? Or will you fight for the centuries-old oppression that has been locked in place?
There you go.
Whether or not you are personally racist, whether or not you personally dislike people because of the color of their skin, if you align with the people that do because they want the same tax cuts as you want, or they want the same, they feel the same way about this or that policy, about the Second Amendment or military abroad or whatever. If you align yourselves with racists, it doesn't matter whether you're personally racist or not. You're compromising the issue in order to achieve something that you want.
Or if you are just complicit with the systems, right? Which is one reason I fight so hard for criminal justice reform, because in my heart, I truly believe that true seed of racism was planted in the criminal justice system right after the emancipation during Jim Crow. After that seed of racism was planted in this country, now that seed has grown into a tree. And you just hit on it. Now it's branched out into education, school to prison pipeline. It's branched out into healthcare. See what happened with COVID. It's branched out into our jobs. You don't get paid equally. We can see it in the socioeconomic disparity. So it started there, and it's just branched throughout every system that we have in America. And I truly believe that if we don't ever get to comprehensive criminal justice reform, right? Now, comprehensive criminal justice reform has many components, including reparations. If we never get there, we're just putting a Band-Aid on this thing, right? It doesn't matter that Trump's in office. It don't matter. Look, I hear a lot of people saying, man, we just got to get Trump out of office. Got to get Trump. Trump ain't the be-all, end-all. Hell, if voting and putting somebody in office was the be-all, end-all, well, then in 2008, this world should have been just hunky-dory when we put the first black man in office. That's not the totality of the issue. We have to dig this seed out, man, and totally get rid of. And when you're talking criminal justice reform, and I always bring up comprehensive because you know we can do one or two of the components, get rid of them. For example, in the First Step Act, which is really good legislation, deals with reentry and rehabilitation, right? where they identify inmates 6 months to a year before they get out. They work with them, they get their paperwork together, they reacclimate them back out into society and the workforce. Well, if you only have reentry and rehabilitation, but you don't deal with the collateral consequences of having a felony attached to your name, check the box. What have you done? These same people that you have helped get back out into society, they can't get a job. They can't get an apartment. But you got to check the box for that too. They can't even further their education because you got to check the box on the Pell Grant. So I mean, you've done one part, but if you don't do this other part, the recidivism remains, the mass incarceration remains. It needs to be approached in a comprehensive manner.
You're absolutely
and
right.
that's one way that we began to eradicate racism in this country.
And I couldn't agree with you more. And and again, we get back to we personally can, erase hate from our hearts. We can personally stand shoulder to shoulder with our Black brothers and sisters in the protest line. We can, as business owners, make sure that we are hiring people and giving people second chances on criminal convictions and hiring people from an oppressed background and those sorts of things. However, without legislative solutions.
Can you really erase hate from your heart?
You know what? And you're probably right. You're probably right that you can't. And
if it was that easy, bro, I'd be running around this country with an eraser right now, just swiping it all clean.
And it is probably one of those things where, the more educated thing to say is acknowledging the implicit racism in our hearts and the way that, having been raised in a racist society, those implicit assumptions that we make, acknowledging those and trying to actively work against those.
Right. That's hard to do, man. That's hard to say, man. Damn, I might be racist. Dang, I might be. I've been complicit with this system, which means that, damn, I'm a racist. That's hard to say. It wasn't hard for me to say that I have implicit bias. It wasn't hard for me to say, that I'm prejudiced against this, that, and that. Because it's a difference having implicit bias and prejudice than being racist. Racist is structural. We don't have the power as Black people to be racist. We can't. We can't hold you back from anything. We can't oppress you. And so, it's easy for me to say that I have these issues and I have to deal with them. My brothers in Sunday school will tell you that, man, I can't tell you how many times Deacon Williams has come in here and said, man, I need prayer this morning because I don't want my anger to turn to hate. That's me acknowledging what I have and dealing with it. It's got to be done on the other side too.
Sure.
I had this lady send me an email this morning. She was a lady that I was battling against in this last SDC election. So she sends me an email to say, see, I'm not as horrible as you think, because this paper just printed my op-ed on ending police brutality. See, I'm a good white person.
Mm-hmm.
What she was really doing was confirming what I knew about her all the time, that she is draped in her white entitlement. Let me tell you, boy, how to think about me. You don't have the right to tell me who I am. Let me tell you who I am, and you need to fall in line.
Sure.
See, she just confirmed how I felt about her.
Well, and that gets back to what we were saying earlier about granting space for people to speak, and that it's, you know, it's more powerful to be able to say, look, you know, instead of let me go pen an op-ed about how we need to end police brutality, let me say, well, you know what? I have the contact for the editor who wants an op-ed about ending police brutality. Let me go reach out to the NAACP or friends of mine who are active in the community or whatever. And how about, can you please, you know, use this platform, which I have found, and using the advantages that we have been given to empower the voices that might not otherwise have access to it. And,
you know, white people got to see that, man. You know, I mean, this shit ain't brand new, right? I mean, if what we've been doing for this long hasn't worked, if standing up saying thoughts and prayers hasn't worked, if standing before a mic like they did up in Pearland the other day and basically say, see, I ain't racist, but ain't shit happen after that, if that hadn't worked, then we need to do something else.
mm-hmm.
I wish I would have heard some of those police officers up there say, listen, I just looked at my staff and it is not representative of the demographics of this county. We are changing our hiring practices. Listen, we have cultural diversity training, but it's done by a white person. We need to do this different. And we're going to implement consequences for non-compliance to this training. Tell me something you're doing. Don't just sit up there and pacify me over and over again like we've been doing for hundreds of years. And black people have been sitting back for years. I mean, we haven't been the aggressors.
Mm.
We have not. And so to sit up here and say, we just need more love, hell, we've been loving for 400 years. We've been complying for 400 years.
Yeah.
So that shit ain't working. We need to do something else.
When it does get back.
Go
ahead.
Or maybe y'all need to do something else.
And I agree. And I think, and as somebody who is trying to make some of these structural changes, those structural changes, and this was really, again, where I was getting back to you know, what founded this conversation is how do we do more than just say pretty words? How do we say more than just say, I am an ally, I stand with you, and you know, I you know, empathize with your plight, and I don't want it to happen.
You know, I hear that a lot, man, and I appreciate you asking me that, and I appreciate other white people asking other black people. And I don't know how this is gonna sound. Hell, man, we tired of teaching all that. We tired. Shit, y'all know what the problems are. Y'all know what the issues are, right? Like I said, bring these numbers together, man. Let's change some policy. Let's change some legislation. Look at yourself in the mirror. Look, there was a casualness of the way that officer killed George Floyd. He's got his knee on his neck with his hand in his pocket, right? Just casually killing this brother. This is what pains the black community so bad, because America has been casually watching this racism for years. You're looking at the numbers. Hey, baby. And see, that's the one we're fighting for right there.
Go scam.
You're looking at on what happened in COVID-19 to Black people, and that's just the kind of casual look, right? We look at all these other injustices that have happened, and there's been no justice, and it's kind of a casual look. It stays in the paper for a couple of days, and it's gone. It's this casualness of accepting this racism. And it ain't like you don't know what it is, Travis. It's not like Dylan don't know what it is. It's not like all of my other white friends don't know what it is. They know what it is. I mean, damn. I don't know what I can teach you.
No, I agree. And it really gets back to that structuralness, and without the problem's too big to solve one person at a time.
Right.
And the problem is too big for us to go through and educate each white advocate as to how to be a better white advocate, or each, marginally racist person to be slightly less racist. It's too big for a person by person approach. And so we really do have to look at the structure that founds these sorts of programs. Look at the way that our state policy addresses policing statewide, which in Texas, most police forces don't participate in the FBI use of force program.
You know where police forces came from, right?
What's that?
You know where police forces originated, right?
Posses and less generously lynch mobs.
No. They were originally slave catchers. Go Google it, look it up. Police started as slave catchers. And you almost see that same mentality today. When you're talking about tearing down these structural systems, man, hell, it's been built up on this shit for years. When you go to the Texas Ordinance of Secession of 1861, and you read the true reasons why Texas seceded, right? It will tell you in there that they felt that God told them that Black people were basically animals and were supposed to be slaves to white people. They said God told them that. It is in the Texas 1861 Ordinance of Secession. That's what we built on. Now, that wasn't that long ago, bro. That was 1861. Right? Now, you think about the people that wrote that ordinance had children and taught them the same thing. And their grandchildren, the same thing. Their children are now running this country.
You're absolutely right.
This stuff goes deep, bro. And one thing that we don't have is or haven't purposely have not been educated enough. Right? Folks don't know. Otherwise, my white friends would not tell me, well, Robert, I never owned any slaves. I get so tired of hearing that shit.
Sure.
It's like they don't understand the history and the damage that was done to my people for 400 years of slavery and how that manifests itself even today.
Absolutely.
I had one friend, I brought up reparation to him, and he started laughing. He literally laughed at me because he doesn't understand the history and the need to repair the damage of America's original sin. And until we start doing those things, and that's why I'm a huge supporter of HR 40, House Resolution 40 up in Congress right now. Because what it is, it establishes a commission to do a study on slavery and the effects that it has had on Black people. And after they do the study and the effects, then they offer solutions to repair this damage. The damage has not been repaired. We put these little Band-Aids on it. We're saying thoughts and prayers, and man, I'll come stand, I'll do this or another. We need to repair the damage. Otherwise, you're riding around on a bicycle with a wobbly wheel.
Yeah, and there is not a white person in this country who has not benefited because of the systems of racism that have been put in place for generations. I remember being told by my grandfather, who in retrospect was not the most progressive person on the planet, that my family got here in 1870, and there were no slaves when the Bolts got to America in 1870. So why should we feel responsible for what happened before that? However, I also know that that same grandfather was president of the Chamber of Commerce in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968, and was part of what led to the sanitation workers strike, which ends up with MLK getting killed. And he could not see how in the 100 years that we had been in this country up to that point, how he and his family had been systemically, generation after generation, put into a position where the German immigrants who show up in Charlottesville in 1870 had inherent advantages over the newly freed slaves that would have been in Charlottesville at that same point in time. And the fact that he's in a position to send my father to college, which gets me in on a scholarship, is all, you can directly trace that line back to these systems of oppression, which are generationally founded.
You know how they had, because when they came over in the boat, he at least had $2 or $3 or $5 in his pocket.
More than that,
the emancipation, one day we were free. The next day we were just thrown in the woods. Imagine that. Imagine that now. Being enslaved for all this time. Maybe you have some of your family. No, you don't. Maybe you don't. All of a sudden, you're out there in the wood. The only clothes you got is the clothes they let you put on your back while you was out there picking cotton. You don't have a penny to your name. Ain't nobody want to hire you right now because they're still looking at you at 3/5 of human being. How do you make it? Now, we were originally offered 40 acres and a mule. But see, this is how far systemic racism goes back. President Johnson at that time, with his racist ass, he knew that if we got 40 acres and a mule, that sounds funny to some people, but what that really would have represented at that time was 400,000 acres of material wealth, generational wealth that we could now, it represented giving us that leg up, right? Where we had a chance to make it. He knew that. That's why he took it away. And so with your grandfather, he came here at $2 or $3 in his pocket. He also had the benefit of having white skin. They would hire him at the local store, right? He'd build up a little something and he could get credit at the bank. We go down the street, man, they're looking to hang us, right? Jim Crow laws came into being right there. A black man spit on the side of the road. That was enough to send him to prison. And that's not just a joke. They called them vagrancy laws. And they had them there for a reason. Because once they put that black man in prison for spitting on the side of the road, then they also had the convict leasing law. That now that we got him in prison, now we can lease his butt right back out there to the cotton field, working for free as a slave, as we did before. These are the systemic issues that we are building, that this country was founded on, and they still exist today. Because of the 13th Amendment, hell, the same thing going on right now.
You're absolutely right. And we still have vagrancy laws. We've still criminalized homelessness. We've still criminalized mental illness.
Yes.
And we criminalize lack of access to health care. We criminalize truancy from school. We criminalize a bunch of these things which are inherently disproportionately impacted on populations of color, which feeds them into the prison system, which of course corporations make, profits upon profits, enslaving black bodies into the prison system. And you're absolutely right, leasing them back out still today to do manual labor on the side of highways, to press license plates, and to do other things at 13 cents an hour.
They do more than press license plates, and in Texas they don't get compensated at all. Mm-hmm. Texas is one of 3 states where they have absolutely no compensation. And license plate, man, the tires that's on your car probably came out of prison. The furniture that's in your house, the McDonald's uniforms that you see, they come out of prison. I mean, it's just absolutely free labor made on the backs of these people because of the accept clause in the 13th Amendment.
Yep.
Still exists today. And that's what I was talking about, the casualness of how we look at racism today. When I was at session in Austin last session, man, and I forget what bill I was testifying on, but this subject came up. And there was this old white Republican guy up there. And he at first what was he arguing about? Well, the story is he did not know that inmates in Texas, and he's a representative now, he didn't know that inmates in Texas were not compensated for their labor. He was mad as hell. I remember Representative Allen then got up and gave a big class on it, boy. Had the whole hearing room standing up. I mean, it was an educational course, and this old white guy, he actually, after that, sponsored a bill, and I'm not sure if that bill passed or not, but he actually sponsored a bill to change that because of education, because of understanding, because now all of a sudden, I didn't own any slave. That's blown up now. That's blown up.
Right, because you participate in the system that propagates private prisons, slave prison labor.
Absolutely.
And yeah, these things are very much things that exist today. In my opinion, as with a lot of the systemic problems that exist in our society, Congress at the federal level tends to do broad arching umbrella bills, and then they pass all the responsibility down to the states. And then the states are actually the ones who are responsible for, well, Congress told us to do this, but how effectively do we actually want to do this? And so what I see are roadblocks to just about every national progressive agenda item that we have gets roadblocked at the State House. And here in Texas,
in the Democratic Party.
And within the Democratic Party. You're absolutely right. And that's why we need to not just...
on the temporary platform committee, when we had our first meeting with Representative Cecile Israel and John Boosie. At the end of that meeting, one of the guys that was on the committee, he's been on committee for like 30 years. I'll never forget him saying this. He said, we must be careful that we don't put any platform items here that our candidates will have to run away from. This is the Democratic Texas Party platform. And you know what he was talking about? He's talking about criminal justice reform. So we can't just play it that it's all the Republicans. Hell, when I was at the session, I got more help from the Texas Young Republicans than I did from Democrats. As a matter of fact, the Texas Young Republicans right now, matter of fact, this evening, are hosting a panel discussion on policy incentives directly for this situation that we are in right now. The Texas Young Republicans are doing that. They are looking at solutions. I looked at the Texas Democratic Party is having their convention today, and when you look down their schedule, you can go on there and see it. Mm-hmm. You have to go all the way down to number 31, and the only mention of black people is how to earn the black vote.
Now, hang on. I took a look at the Democratic Party platform that came out today, and they've got 3 pages on criminal justice.
No. I actually chaired the committee for criminal justice reform. That's on the platform. I'm talking about on the schedule for the Democratic Party convention that's going on right now. Sure. They have a schedule of events. And when you look at those schedule of events, you have to get all the way down to 31. And the only mention of black people is how to earn the black vote. That's all it means, though. We just want their vote.
Well, that needs to be something that we need to change. Yeah, it's definitely something that we need to change.
Yeah. I mean, kind of casually how you look at it right there. Yeah, we just need to change it. Is this casual nature? No, nobody gives a damn about, well, it is what it is. We can't say nothing about the Democratic Party. Now, let me tell you something. Power concedes nothing without demands, right? And we can sit up here and continually take all this crap as long as we want. I had people getting on me for writing up our response to Joe Biden's Lift Every Voice platform for Black America, which was toothless, which was all rhetoric, right? So we wrote up a line-by-line response to him trying to help Biden, actually, because unless Biden can bring along this young black vote and these progressives, he's not going to win, right? And so it wasn't trying to hurt him, but it was trying to help him. But people acted like we were wrong for advocating for our issues and concerns. We just got to get Trump out of it. No, I want somebody in there that's going to pay attention to my issues and concerns, right? Because it hasn't happened all the way up until right now.
You're right, and this needs to be more about the actual policy objectives that we're trying to achieve, and less about the person who's going to have their name signed on the bill. Because so much more of the changes that we're trying to implement are taken at the state house level, at the congressional level. Individual legislatures have the power to push forward a lot of these structural changes that we're talking about. And that's so much more important. I mean, we need to get rid of Trump, but there's so much more that has to be done.
Walk and chew gum, right? We can walk and chew gum. We got 5 months until the election is here. We still got time, to change that stuff, man, because legislation and policy is so important. Mm-hmm. You know, one statement by Dr. Martin Luther King that always sticks with me, when he said, man, we cannot stop them from not loving us, but we can stop them from lynching us, mm-hmm. which was a direct policy a direct reference to policy and legislation, right? It's so important. Until there is this great moral revolution in this country, and I don't see that on the horizon anywhere coming up. Until that happens, there has to be protective policy in there, right?
Sure. No, and that's what, and when we talk about protective policy, when we talk about structurally combating police brutality, mm-hmm. A lot of that is state level policy as to how mm-hmm. the state adjudicates how police officers are trained. Mm-hmm. So if we at the state level were to implement a statewide licensing board for law enforcement officers that allowed us to have state level training for implicit bias, de-escalation of force, and licensing law enforcement officers, which would allow that license to be revoked if we see excessive use of force. This would prevent law enforcement officers from hopscotching across little communities in Texas, which we know happens, where somebody gets fired from one office for brutality, and then they show up and they're the sheriff in the next town at the next election. But that's a
as we write bills, those stipulations have to be in there. Right, because as I said earlier, I mean they've got some of this stuff you're talking about already, right? Mm-hmm. But the loopholes are there, and so we continue to hire these up. Like for example, if an officer gets fired right now, he's not supposed to be able to get hired over here, and so what they do is allow them to come back in and resign. Mm-hmm. I had a sheriff tell me this just the other day. They allowed, and he said it happens all the time. They allow them to come back and resign instead of being fired. And so now they're able to get rehired, across the country. On the cultural diversity training, man, there has to be stipulations in there. And we have 3 specific asks for them. Number one, that is done by an outside source, right? Because right now it's just done by, you know, the old white guy that's sitting down on the end of the desk, been there 30 years, you know, and he does an 8-hour course in 30 minutes and say, y'all can go home now, right?
Yeah.
Well, they can say they did the training, but you didn't get nothing out of it. So it needs to be done by an outside source. It needs to be continual, needs to be refreshed.
Sure.
And number 3, and most importantly, there has to be consequences for non-compliance. And listen to this. If there were consequences for non-compliance, George Floyd would be alive today. This dude had 16 infractions on him already, right? And they basically said, well, you just push the nigger around over there and let him get back out on the street and do what he was doing. And he ended up killing this man. That's the importance of having policy and legislation in place. And as I said, making sure that your specific stipulations and asks are in these bills.
Absolutely. Robert, I really want to thank you for taking the time to sit down and talk with me. I'm sure we could go on for quite some time about this kind of stuff. But particularly with as charged as things have been lately, I really want to appreciate the time that you take to sit down and talk to me about these issues. I really appreciate that.
Oh, you're welcome, man. I had to think twice about coming on. I really didn't want to come on. As I said, these conversations are difficult. They are very emotional for us right now. Our heart is raw, but they're also necessary to have. And when you called me, there was a sincerity in your voice, and I answered the call for you, bro. And I hope we did something today.
I hope so too.
We can move the conversation forward.
Well, and the one thing that I know, just like we talked before, that justice with these officers is not going to be the end of the conversation. We're not going to accomplish or solved much with a 1-hour Facebook Live conversation. So I very much look forward to being a partner with you going forward and working on these issues in the long run. And
I do as well, Travis. And good luck to you on your race out there, brother.
Thanks so much.
Pulling for you.
You take care, Robert.
You too.